Hi guys, so today we are going to be talking through chapter 14, the second half. This one is still on primary producers, but we're going to be talking a little bit more of what we think of when we think of primary producers, which is going to be our plant life, or in this case, our algae life. So let's go ahead and get started. This should be fairly quick because most of this is pretty common sense for you guys. So, of course, we know that seaweed and marine plants, there are a ton of different ones out there, just like any type of plant on Earth. Now, between 1% and 5% of all productivity is going to be carried out by these seaweeds. So, this is essentially what's going to make up all of the primary productivity that we haven't already discussed from our phytoplankton. So anything they're not already creating, the rest is being carried by these marine plants. Now, seaweed are not plants, and this is something I want to go ahead and specify here in the beginning. They're actually a type of multicellular algae. So they're going to be structurally different, which we'll talk about later on. And they're actually going to be classified, as a type of protozoan. So they are going to be very different, even though they look very similar and they just look like underwater plants. They are actually a different type of algae. Now, most of these, of course, are going to grow in the topmost layer of the ocean, the aphotic zone, because they are going to depend on the sunlight for photosynthesis. So obviously they're not going to be too far down except for very few very specialized species, which we'll talk about at the end. But in general, there are over 7,000 species of marine algae identified. This doesn't include marine plants or grasses. This is just going to be seaweed. So still very, very, very many different types that we have identified, and we're still finding more every single day. So because seaweed do live in a very specific type of environment, more so than any other type of normal plant, seaweeds and these algae are going to find themselves needing to be suited for these environments in ways that other primary producers don't have to worry about. For example, a lot of seaweeds, of course, are going to find themselves exposed to air and sunlight when the tide is out, because, like I said, they're going to be in that euphotic zone, which is where all that sunlight is. And a lot of the times, this is going to place them in that tidal region where they're going to be completely submerged when high tide is in, and then left out when low tide is out. So they're going to have to be able to withstand that desiccation that would happen if the sun were on them for long, extended periods of time when the water is not covering them completely. They also have to be able to handle being lashed against the rocks when the tide is in. Anytime you're having that tide movement, especially in some of your larger tide shifts, you're going to have to be able to have a good type of sediment to hold on to. And whenever those waves come in and rock them against the rocks or whatever debris is around them, they have to be able to withstand that beating. So this is where they're going to differ out a little bit from your standard plant as well. So now, of course, we know, like with our phytoplankton that we talked about at the beginning of your last part, the warmth and nutrients. Of course, this is going to limit the success or failure of different types of seaweeds or algae. So obviously water that is too warm is not going to be very well suited for the amount of nutrients that needs to be in the water in order for them to be successful. And same thing with too cold. If the water is too cold or halfway to frozen, it's also going to limit the success of these algae plants. Now, warmer temperatures can inhibit photosynthesis and respiration. Again, we talked about this whenever we were talking through phytoplankton. It's not necessarily the area that gets the most sunshine or the warmest amount of sunshine. It's going to be the quality of the sunshine. And these are going to be just like your phytoplankton. They're not going to be able to survive in nutrient poor waters because even though they are photosynthesizers, they do still need that inorganic nutrients in order to be successful. Now, another difficulty that they're going to have to face is also going to be the location that they can survive. It's not just going to be the water around them, but also adequate substrate for them to grab onto. Now, we're going to look at what the anchorage basically of your seaweed is going to be in a second when we actually look at the structure of a seaweed. But they have to attach to a very solid surface at the bottom of the ocean. Otherwise, they'll just float away. So if they don't have adequate substrate or a firm footing, then they're not going to be able to survive. So this is why you're going to see less than 2% of the ocean floor is actually going to be covered by seaweed. And this is because other than that, these other areas of the ocean floor don't have enough solid material for them to latch onto and grow from. Now, on the bright side, they are going to see a lot of positive adaptations that they have gained through evolution. One example of this is going to be they don't have to worry about droughts. And again, just like our phytoplankton, we talked about carbon dioxide, which is very plentiful in our ocean waters. Both of these things are going to allow for photosynthesis, so we don't have to worry about them being limiting factors. Seaweed also doesn't require a strong support structure. So again, when we actually look at the anatomy of a algae, we are going to see that they don't require a structure similar to a stem or a trunk because they're actually going to be able to float through the water. So this means they can devote their entire body to photosynthesis rather than having to have these large and heavy structures made just as a support feature that doesn't really carry out any type of primary productivity. Now, because of this, and because of the high productivity that they are creating, products from photosynthesis are constantly diffusing from their bodies. This has always reminded me of tea. When you drop a tea bag into a cup of hot water and it's actually diffusing off that tea bag from the little tea leaves. This is very much what's happening with these seaweed substrates that are actually in the ocean. There's constantly going to be the results of their photosynthesis just coming off of their blades, very much like a diffusing tea bag. Now, this is where I was going to say we're going to actually look at the structure. So like I said, seaweed is not a plant. It's a little bit different. So common terms like leaf, stem, and roots are considered inappropriate because these things assume the presence of vessels. Regular plants have vessels running through the entire plant because its root system is soaking up nutrients from the ground, and that vascular system and those vessels are going to be transporting that nutrients through their body. This is not the case with seaweeds. Seaweeds don't have a root system because they are producing all of their own nutrients and they're getting the rest from the water. So they don't actually have a root system. In place of the root system, they're going to have a structure called a holdfast. This is essentially going to be an anchor. It'll anchor them to the sand or the rock or whatever substrate it is that they're attached to at the bottom of the ocean. So it doesn't actually pull nutrients like roots does. It literally is just holding them to the floor. Now, similar to a stem, we already talked about, it doesn't have to have a stem or a trunk structure like a land plant would because they are being held up by the water around them. So instead, they have something called a stipe, which is just going to be the very center part that the blades are going to come off of. And which takes us to the blades. This is going to be the equivalent of a leaf. This is where a majority of your photosynthesis is going to be. This is where the shapes can definitely differ depending on the type of seaweed that you are looking at, but they can be anywhere from very tiny, almost like a moss, to very, very tall. Of course, the largest one is going to be those kelps, if you've ever seen a picture of a kelp forest, and they can exceed anywhere from 200 feet tall, and they grow very, very quickly, up to 20 inches per day. So kelp forests are a very large producer on the food chain because of that high primary productivity. Now, seaweeds are going to be classified in a couple of different ways. The easiest way that we're going to look at them is going to be by their color. Each seaweed is going to have the presence of a colored compound in their tissue dependent upon the species of seaweed that they are. These colors are called their accessory pigments. This is just going to be the light absorbing pigments in their bodies. So this is going to be very similar to the chlorophyll that we see in land plants that turns their leaves green. Same idea, but these are going to be separated into 3 different groups. They're either going to be green algae, brown algae, or red algae. So if anyone is a big snorkeler or likes to go scalloping in the Gulf, of course, you've probably seen a lot of green and brown algae, whereas you're going to see a lot of that red algae in areas closer to coral reefs, so similar to Australia and so on. So we're going to see a lot more green and brown here around the coastline of Florida. Now, when we come into contact with seaweed in the ocean, we think of them in a very specific way, but we don't actually realize that a lot of seaweed is collected for commercial use as well. So I'm going to kind of go through, you don't have to write all these. These are just some examples for you guys, but these are some of the things that we actually have seaweed as a product, as an ingredient in that we come into contact with pretty often. So if you go have your clothes dry cleaned, or if you use a spray to iron with your clothes, this helps to stiffen those fabrics. You're going to find seaweed in those products. You're going to find seaweed in a lot of your adhesives. If you've ever plucked a piece of seaweed and kind of broken it up, they are going to have kind of that sticky, almost mucousy feel from the inside. So this is used in the ingredients for a lot of your adhesives. Seaweed is actually used in a lot of salad dressings, specifically a lot of oil-based dressings, because it helps to suspend the water and oil together so they don't split. You're going to have seaweed in a lot of different types of ice cream, because this actually helps prevent the formation of crystals in your ice cream. So if you have ice cream in the freezer too long, it doesn't get freezer burn. You're going to keep those crystals from forming. So think about that next time you have an ice cream cone, is it have a little bit of a seaweed flavor. We use seaweed types to clarify beer and wine. Of course, we're going to have it in different types of soaps and shaving cream. Similar to our salad dressings, we do actually use seaweed inside milk, specifically chocolate milk. Again, this is going to keep it from separating into a chocolate, and your standard white milk keeps it nice and mixed up. We also have seaweeds in toothpaste. This one's my favorite, because anytime you brush your teeth and that toothpaste kind of has that gritty feeling, so your teeth feel nice and clean and well scrubbed, this is actually going to be little bits of seaweed that they're using to give you that kind of gritty texture that helps scrub down your actual teeth. And then, of course, we use seaweed in laboratory cultures. A lot of the time, these are going to be what is in your discs or your trays whenever you are running a culture. So you'll swab whatever it is you're trying to test or trying to grow. And those cultures of seaweed, they're very nutritious. And so this causes a lot of things to grow pretty quickly. So this is why we use it in laboratories. Now, let's talk a little bit about the difference between seaweed and seagrasses. So like I said, seagrass is actually a plant, where seaweed, as we know now, is an algae. So now seagrasses are not going to be nearly as plentiful as seaweed. Seaweed, we said there's over 7,000 species. Seagrasses, there's only going to be around 45 species known. A lot of these are going to be very shallow type waters, more so than our deeper depths. Now, they're going to have leaves and stems and roots. So again, instead of having that hold fast system, they are actually going to be pulling nutrients from the ground, because they're not going to have that same gathering process as your algae would. Now, similar to a regular plant, with these seagrasses, they actually will put out pollen. This pollen will then be picked up by the water around them and fertilize and then grow more seagrass. So a little bit different than our seaweed, which is just going to flower and blood. Now, mangroves, which y'all watched this video last week, are going to be a type of plant. They are a tree. You saw what they look like, and you got to see their seeds, which is why I really like that video that you just watched. So these are going to be considered marine plants because of what they do for a lot of ocean species. So even though they're not completely underwater and they are a land plant, because of all that they provide for marine habitats, we do consider them a marine plant. So these are also going to be very important in the stabilization of coastal wetlands. Like you saw in that video, there was a lot of harm coming from those areas that were having the mangrove forest taken out, and now they're actually going to a lot of trouble to put them back in to stabilize a lot of the area as far as the land around there and as providing a better environment for the organisms that are typically found at the base of those trees. Whereas if those trees are gone, a lot of those organisms are going to have nowhere to go. All right. And now talking a little bit about trench producers, these are just going to be the ones, like I had mentioned earlier, are going to be the rare few that are actually found not in that euphotic zone immediately in the sunlight. So these are actually pretty recently discovered species. They're going to be found very, very deep down in the trenches, around 8,000 feet below our normal water column where we find most of our other algae or seagrasses. So because obviously light is not penetrating these areas, instead they have evolutionized themselves to find what is going to be the littlest teeny tiny bit of light at the bottom of the ocean, and they use that to power their photosynthesis without the sunshine. And by doing so, they have actually become some of the most potent primary producers at the bottom of the ocean because they are dealing with relatively little competition. So what they do is they plant themselves around what's called a hydrothermal vent. These vents are going to be releasing very hot, very chemically heavy water that is coming straight from the center of the earth with everything else that is pouring out. And when it does so, because it is so hot, it's going to radiate such a very dim red light. And these organisms are actually going to use that dim red light to power that photosynthesis. So it's going to act as a sun for them, even though it's going to be very, very, very low amount of light down there. So it's not going to be like a flashlight that'll allow us to see that deep down, but it's just enough that they are able to provide themselves with the nutrients that they need. And this is very, very important for us in marine biology, because this is going to be a new type of species that we can actually study, and we call them extremophiles, because they're able to withstand 750 degree water that's coming from these vents. I mean, just incredibly hot, incredibly full of very, very strong chemicals. And we actually are studying these organisms and applying it into our health science fields to see how we might be able to use some of the adaptations that these extremophiles and potentially use it in medical application later on down the road. So these were a pretty big find and very interesting primary producers because they're so very different from the algae and seagrasses that we see in our euphotic zones. So that is all for your part 2 of this chapter. Make sure you have the plankton and the seaweed notes in your journal. They are both going to be a part of your next test. You are going to be finishing up starting and finishing up your seaweed project. This is going to be a paper that you will write. It's done in class. Everything is given to you as far as instructions. If anyone has any questions on that, feel free to email me. For 3rd, 6th, and 7th, that is due for you guys on Wednesday. And for my tire blog, that is due on Friday. And then we're going to be prepping to wrap up this chapter and take our test. So sorry if you guys heard my little baby in the background. He was tired of me talking. So I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I will hear from you very, very soon.